Okay, we're live now. Greetings to everybody. Good evening. Welcome to what is the eighth installment of the interview series that the Center for Freedom and Justice Colorado is undertaking. CFJ Colorado is a nonprofit organization based in the Front Range of Colorado, mostly Denver. Our mission is to provide education about and support for the town of Beit Umar. Beit Umar is in Area C of the West Bank in occupied Palestine. My name is Rob Prince, and I am a member of CFJ Colorado. Some housekeeping items before we get underway. Be sure to check out our website at the banner on the bottom of your screen, as well as our contact information. And please feel free to email or write us to be added to our contact list. The interview today will last about 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes questions and answers. And we would ask you to use the chat features either in the YouTube or Facebook programs, whichever one you're using. We encourage you to hold off on those questions, though, until the question and answer session begins. So now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Oti. Jennifer Oti is a member of our group. Jennifer finds it important to work for Palestine and to share the situation of the Palestinian people to people here in the United States. A people that deserve our sympathy and support. Jennifer, I turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob. Really appreciate that introduction. And Jeff and Janet, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. So this interview will be a little bit different because it takes a little more of a personal slant rather than these world events that are going on, but you've certainly been integral in the world events. So why don't we start off with you telling our audience a little bit about yourselves, kind of where you live, your background, what you've done in the past work-wise, but we'll dive into the specifics of your work in Israel-Palestine later, but just a little overview for our viewers.
Yeah, Jennifer, could we just start by saying that our hearts are broken and we're completely exercised by what's going on in Afghanistan right now and in Haiti, and those are just the more examples of what's going on all around the world in terms of the brokenness and that. But our hearts go out, and we want to do more than hearts and prayers, love and prayers to those folks. We're concerned and trying to figure out what we can do in more concrete and practical ways. So thanks. Do you want to start by saying anything about?
Sure. I'm Janet Wright, and we live in Windsor, Colorado. Spent many years in Fort Collins, just down the road. And I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I've spent my career working in lots of different settings, particularly around treating trauma and grief and loss and PTSD. And now I provide trainings in EMDR, which is a treatment for trauma, and also do some consultation with clinicians.
Thank you. And Jeff?
Yep. I'm retired from pastoral ministry with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I started the congregation in Fort Collins, Heart of the Rockies Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and was ordained right out of seminary and have been in ministry all of these years. And then most recently, I've been appointed as a global service worker, volunteer to Kairos Palestine, which is a Christian organization in headquartered, office in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And they are working both to do the theology and how Christians may be moved to respond to places of darkness and evil and occupation, kind of documenting what's going on, as well as moving folks to do something in response to that brutal occupation that's gone on now for over 50 years.
For sure.
And I'll just say that my work here, though I'm a mission worker there for that group, is really at the computer right here in the office, doing editing and writing articles on behalf of Kairos Palestine.
Great. Yep. So you're we're right up the same alley. That's a lot what we do in our little Center for Freedom and Justice, Colorado, is really educating the public and letting people know about what's going on, kind of revealing behind the curtain what goes on that so many Americans just don't even realize in Palestine. And thank you for your comments about Haiti and Afghanistan. Some very good friends of mine have family members who are trapped over there, and they were not able to get out in time. So, just a quick plug, anyone who's listening, if you can write your members of Congress, anyone, and just try to get those Afghanis who've helped the United States over to our country to safety. Appreciate it. So,
Yes.
Jeff, you went to Israel, Palestine back in 1998 when you were on sabbatical. And I know this because for our viewers, Jeff and Janet and I had some time to talk ahead of time. So that was wonderful. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience during that trip and how it basically influenced the next 23 years of your life?
Yes, and I'll say first of all that Janet and I took what would be described as a typical Holy Land tour in 1986. And we had a Jewish guide and a Muslim bus driver, and we had no idea when we crossed into the West Bank that we were crossing into occupied territory. We were told when the bus landed on the square there in front of Manger Church that we were told, don't do anything but get off the bus, go straight in to see where your Christ was born and get right back on the bus, because this is a very dangerous area. Don't do any shopping or anything. And it took a long time before we realized that that's just part of the propaganda that puts the restrictions on the economy in the West Bank, as well as who controls the narrative.
And I'm embarrassed to say that at that time in '86, we did not know much about the situation. We didn't know much about Palestinians. We were kind of typical Americans who, we just read what we read about Israel being such a great country. And we didn't even know better at that point.
And I completely understand that, Janet. When I went to Israel in 2014, they show you that narrow view, and Palestinian children might get on the bus and bomb us, and it's just totally slanted, and that's the narrative that Americans hear. Sounds like your experience and mine were similar, but go ahead.
No, it's amazing, and I forgot what I was. Oh, I do know that I was raised in a pastor's family in what is a progressive denomination, but I think we were probably Christian Zionists without knowing it. We were just grateful that the Jews were able to find a home after this horrible event, which is a terrible, unspeakable event of the Holocaust. But we just kind of followed along in that line until 1998, which is what your question was. I had an opportunity to take a 3-month sabbatical, and I knew I wanted to be overseas somewhere. And it turned out that we had what we would describe at that point as a missionary. There are now mission workers. And the missionary invited me to come to Palestine. She said, I'll find something for you to do. Her name is Marla Schrader. Some may know her out on the East Coast. Marla was there for many years, ended up marrying a Palestinian that she met as he was a Rhodes Scholar out at the University of Southern California. And I was amazed as I heard her talking, because I just went to help out a little bit. I thought I was talking to an anti-Semitic missionary at that point when she would tell me what was really going on. And I asked her about that, and she gave me a couple of books to read while I was there. And you only have to be there for a little time to realize, oh my goodness, what kind of a story have I bought into? And so that was, I got to work at the YMCA's, East Jerusalem YMCA's rehabilitation program just outside of Bethlehem and Beit Sahur. And I didn't speak any Arabic, and the youth I was working with didn't speak any English, but it's just amazing how you can make that connection in any case. And so that was my first experience. And at the end of that time at the Y, the director and associate director asked me out to lunch, and I said, I haven't really done anything. You guys don't need to take any time. And they said, no, we want to take you to lunch. And at the end of the lunch, we were visiting. They said, what does your wife do? And I said, well, she's a social worker, and she does play therapy and art therapy with children. They looked at me and they said, she's the one we want over here, not you. And Janet doesn't believe they actually said that, but they did. And so within months, Janet found really probably one of the premier trainers. You can say a little bit more about that, Janet. And that started, I just fell in love with those folks with their, well, as a Christian, we talk about the three charities of faith, hope, and love. And every time we go over there, we learn a little bit more about what real faith is all about and what true hope is in the midst of hopelessness. And then again, the kind of love that can embrace an enemy while still nonviolently resisting what that enemy is doing.
For sure. So your trip over there really helped open your eyes. And for any viewers that we have, you mentioned that you were unknowingly Christian Zionist, and anytime somebody speaks against what the Israelis are doing against the Palestinians, they must be anti-Semitic. For any of our viewers who don't know about that, could you just take maybe 30 seconds or so and describe what those terms mean? Christian Zionist and this term that's thrown around being anti-Semitic as soon as you say anything against Israel.
Good. Do you want to take that or you want me to?
Go ahead.
Okay. So the term really has been officially described over the years, and it is a hatred toward a people or toward the institutions of that people, expressed either verbally or worse, physically, against their institutions and against the people as a whole because they are Jewish. And so that's the term. Now, I'm going to forget the new definition that has just come out by the Holocaust Remembrance Group has come out with a new definition that our State Department has embraced that really it stretches that definition of anti-Semitic to include criticism of the state of Israel. And that's one of the things that we're addressing in so many different ways. Many states have adopted it. The state of Colorado has actually followed that definition, and in terms of its criticism of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And every time it's gone to court regarding that, the criticism of Israel as a state, it's lost in court. Thanks God, but it's a threat to free speech, and
especially on college campuses.
Yes,
right.
Yeah,
and we maintain that it's okay to criticize a government. We can criticize our government. We can criticize the government of the state of Israel. We're not against the people of Israel on any level, but we are against some of the procedures and policies and laws in the occupation.
Absolutely. And then what about Christian Zionism?
Christian Zionism.
Because we could talk all night about this.
I want to just say www.christianzionism.org. A group of Christians who are quite familiar with what's really going on over there, they got to that web name first. And that's a great place to go and learn about the heresy, as many of us would describe it, of Christian Zionism. It's a reading of the scriptures that really places Israel at the center of history and the unfolding of history. And it concentrates on the 12th chapter of Genesis, where it's reported that God said to Abraham, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And it is, at its heart, it's a theology that is working toward the end times, as if we human beings can bring that about, or as if it's a conflagration that's supposed to happen at the end times. It's a misreading of scripture, in our opinion. And it says that everything that happens to Israel is a part of God's plan. Right. And so we must embrace the state of Israel no matter what.
Okay. All the land that was given to Abraham for the Jews.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's thank you for that. Let's fast forward just a little bit. We were talking about 1998. And so Janet, as Jeff mentioned, they wanted you more than they wanted him. You conducted trainings in the West Bank and Gaza, going there 8 to 10 times between 2005 and 2013. So can you tell us a little bit about the specifics of the work you did, the reception that your work received, and how any sort of legacy that's come of it? What's become of that work that you started?
Yeah, thank you. We became connected, as Jeff said, to the East Jerusalem YMCA Rehabilitation Program. They have 6 field offices in the West Bank. And at the time, they were really wanting to learn more about how to treat trauma and PTSD. Of course, after the Second Intifada, they were clearly seeing very significant injuries, people paralyzed, children arrested, some of what Betty McCollum's bill is going to address, the detention of children, and really how harsh the occupation is in terms of the psychological toll, as well as physical, and killings and shootings and et cetera. So I partnered with the EMDR Humanitarian Assistance Program, which is similar to Doctors Without Borders, only it's for mental health. And we do provide a training in eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a long name. It's now, we have lots of, it's evidence-based. The American Psychological and Psychiatric Associations are all for it. But it's particularly to treat trauma. And initially, I will have to say that there was some hesitation on the part of the therapists. They were very skilled in treating trauma, but this was a Western psychotherapy, and they were uncertain about it. But it works on a brain level, and the most senior counselor, supervisor said, look, if it works on a brain level, it can work here. And she was really, Mona Zagrut, was really instrumental in, we did many, many trainings over the years with really two goals. One was to train therapists to provide this treatment to their people in their language. And the other was to develop a training team that then could provide training to the Arab-speaking countries. And they have a particular expertise in ongoing traumatic stress. We talk about post-traumatic stress, PTSD, but in some parts of the world, it isn't post, it's still happening. And that's what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza. So we actually, over 5 or 6 years, we achieved that goal. There's now a wonderful training team that, they're all Arab, Arab speaking, Arab culture, and they train throughout the Arab world. They go to Africa, and they are now teaching us actually, about resilience and about how do you manage in an ongoing traumatic situation. So it's been really a very encouraging situation, and they're treating many children who have been detained, as well as adults who have experienced significant trauma from the occupation.
Can you say something about the number of therapists and also the coming together of an association of Arab speaking?
Oh, yeah. So, in the West Bank, we've trained over 250 therapists. The West Bank is about the size of New Jersey, so it's a significant psychotherapy there. And now there's developing an association of Arab EMDR therapists throughout the Arab world. So there are 7 countries, Arab-speaking countries, who are joining in an association so that they can have training standards and certifications and share knowledge. And it's really quite exciting what has happened.
So a very successful train the trainer. Are there any statistics these days on the number of people they see or anything? I'm just curious, or any successes?
Well, tremendous success. It's the main modality, psychotherapeutic modality now of the East Jerusalem YMCA. And often people who try many other therapies don't have as much success, so they end up finally coming to the Y saying, gosh, we've heard what you can do. They probably have all those statistics, how many people they see, but I don't have them off the top of my head. Significant success, and I often went out in the field in Hebron or Ramallah to meet with some of the families who had been treated. And it was quite moving. They might have a child who was injured, or perhaps the father was killed. Maybe there was a night raid or a house demolition. And to see how these families are coping through therapy, but also through community support, is really quite encouraging. And they have high resiliency in that culture.
May I tell the story about the girl in the red sweater?
Of course.
I'm asking Janet.
Oh,
Sure. Well, I'll tell.
Good.
We just, our very first pilot project, we weren't sure, would this really be effective in this culture? We did a pilot study with 30 kids over 3 days. I just remember always there was this little girl in the red sweater who was so depressed, no emotion, hardly engaging. We went ahead with the treatment. By the end of the second day, she's tugging on our shirt tails saying, hey, would you take a picture of me? And I mean, her father came to us and said, I don't know what you're doing, but please continue, because for the first time she played with her sister. She braided her sister's hair. She talked to us. She had actually seen her mother shot dead in front of her. And from that time on, she was pretty silent. So it was quite a big step in her own healing.
That is a beautiful story. Very good success.
Yeah.
So with this trauma that you have seen firsthand in the kids in Palestine, that little girl or anyone else, if they were listening to this webinar or contributing to it, here today speaking, what do you think they would want our listeners to know? What would be their main message, those kids that you helped out?
I think they would want people to know they're kids like all kids in the world. They want the same things. They want to play. They want to have safety. They want their families to stay intact. They don't want to walk on the streets with soldiers constantly, or tanks, or gunfire. And I think they would want your listeners to know how proud they are of their culture. They actually have a wonderful culture. Children are so valued in that community. But I think it would be a mixture. They're very honest about the difficulty that they live under, as well as the joys and the family and community connection.
Very nice. Thank you so much. And as you were working with the kids, you were doing art therapy, play therapy. You shared that one story, but what is it like to see kids finally embracing toys or play or the arts? And then are there any specific stories you have about that with the kids that you worked with?
Yeah, it's really like seeing them come back to life in many ways. I mean, we did some art and play therapy, but we really moved to EMDR. And I just always remember we went out to Hebron, in a village outside Hebron, with one of the Y therapists. And he had treated a 10-year-old boy. And the boy's father was shot by Israeli soldiers. And again, in this instance, the boy stopped engaging in school. He had nightmares. And he just wasn't himself in many ways. And actually, it was the grandfather who first worked with the mother to really get her some help. And he came to the Y and said, I've heard that you can help. Would you help my daughter-in-law? And then it was, would you help my grandson? And the grandson had to walk by where his father was murdered every day to go to school. So he was constantly triggered and constantly struggling. But as I met with them, his therapist was Nader. And I just remember that boy sat so close to Nader and was grinning and smiling, and he was back in school. And a terrible thing had still happened, and yet he was able to move forward. And the whole family, we met with the whole family, of course, had tea. But they were very open to talk about how much better it was for their family, right, in spite of a very difficult event.
Right. And these instances that you're talking about, of course, are just small samplings of what goes on there every day.
Yes.
It's constant. It never ends. So many children affected in this way.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a little bit. We're talking about a service tonight. That's kind of our main theme. So Jeff, as a retired pastor of the Disciples of Christ, how do you think your faith has influenced you and what you do? And I think I'm asking this because, most religions, of course, have tenets of social justice. And I think for everyone listening, it's always good to be reminded about those tenets of social justice as reminders of one of the many reasons people can be spurred to action on behalf of another. That's always what we want to encourage, people speaking out and actually doing something. So how, in particular, for any of our listeners of faith, how did that influence you?
I would say for listeners of faith and listeners of goodwill that don't necessarily have to share in some religious faith. There's a whole cadre of those folks out there that have a set of values that see that humankind is worth taking care of, and as well as the environment and one's neighbor next door, as well as the neighbor around the world. So I'm grateful for that group of folks as well. So I think I'm really grateful for having been raised in what is a progressive denomination, and I would cite as one of the early stories. We moved from Central Illinois when I was just after my sophomore year in high school. I moved down to Georgia, and it was the second year of integration when I went to high school down there, and it was an amazing time to be down there. And my dad was a pastor, and he early on preached a sermon where he talked about racial inequality and that. And we were sitting at the Formica lunch table in our home in the kitchen there having lunch, and the phone rang, and I went and answered it on the wall, and it was a call for Dad after Sunday afternoon when we were having lunch. And Dad took the call, and it was just a yes, okay. We knew that it was not a good phone call. And yes. And finally Dad said, "Tell it to God." And he hung up on one of the parishioners in a new appointment in the church. And that, along with his helping to integrate the two ministerial alliances, I think was quite formative in my life as I saw Dad, out of his war experience as well, moving away from the more conservative expression in our denomination to the more progressive. We still weren't allowed to go to football games on Sunday and movies and all that. And when I confronted him, he said, "This is how far I'm coming, and when you raise your kids, you can do what you want." But that movement of social justice expressed in him still moves me. And then, of course, to be in seminary, I went to Princeton Theological Seminary and just had those kind of professors that wanted to make sure that one's faith wasn't just a headpiece, but there was a praxis, a practice of in our faith following after Jesus and picking up a cross. And picking up a cross is, I hate that word burden. I don't believe in that. You're supposed to bear your burdens. That's false language. We don't go finding a cross. We usually have them that are thrust upon us in our lives. And so I was just always aware that we're called to something more than just a belief system. We talk about believing in Jesus. And I've come to understand, not the first, of course, that we are to believe Jesus, not believing in this leader, but to believe what he did and then go do it to the best of our abilities, dependent upon the spirit and the community in which we're living. So that's what has stirred me along the way. And then I remember one scene when I was there just for that 1 month. I saw a young man, tall, thin, kid, probably maybe 14, 16 years old, and he had a box of short pencils, and he was selling the pencils to just get a little money for himself and his family. And I looked at his face, and it was the face of my son, that same age. And so knowing that there's that kind of suffering when we're living in abundance here, it continues to move me to share time, energy, and our financial resources as well. I don't know if that answered the question or not.
It sure did. And I think you make a very valuable point. People have head knowledge of what they should do, whether it's religious faith or conscience or call it whatever you want to. But it's translating it from the head to the heart, like you said, and referencing back what you said at the beginning of the program is it's not just feeling for the people in Kabul or Palestine or Haiti or wherever. It's being spurred to action by that piece inside of us that motivates us. So thank you for that.
Yep, and I would just add this too, that it's commonly understood that one is to put one's faith, according to the Christian religion, in Jesus in order to make one's way into heaven. That there's certain things we're supposed to do to get to heaven, when in our faith we believe that heaven's come down to us, that God's come to us, that we don't have to work our way through to God. God's come to us. And as a result of that, I want to say that Jesus was crucified not because he came to save souls, but because he came to make things right in the world. He lived that life of righteousness, which means setting things in their right relationship. And that's what got him crucified by both religious and secular leaders, because he was challenging the status quo and the systems that oppress people. And that has been the guiding kind of light of my faith and my actions.
Absolutely. Yeah, so he'd have a lot to say today about what's going on in Palestine, for sure. So at the beginning of the program, you mentioned, and you told me this before, that you just admired the Palestinians' faith, hope, and love. And so can you tell us a little bit more about that? What do you admire about it? What did you see? Why are they so strong?
You want to say a little bit about that?
Well, I can add a little bit and then you pick it up. I think that their incredible connection with community and family. It's not like in the West where we are so individualistic and want to be so self-sufficient. They are very dependent and connected with each other. And there's really certain gifts that come out of that, of resilience. But I always feel like their faith has been really tested, whether they are Christian or Muslim or Jew. Their faith has been tested in a way that many of us have not in the US. And so I'm always just encouraged to see what it means for people to keep a faith, to keep hope in the face of hopelessness, to still hold out for what is right and good in the world and in people. And so that's always personally really moving to me.
Yeah, and I would say the faith piece is just to see how they put their faith, their trusting Jesus, they're believing Jesus when he says, love your enemy and do what is right, etc. That faith gets practiced day by day. The hope piece, I hope for a new car every 6 or 8 years. I hope that we have good health. I hope our kids are doing well, but their hope is really in the midst of hopelessness of the occupation, which is a daily brutal occupation that controls where they can go to school, whom they can marry, where they can travel. It's just a complete a complete occupation, and they would like to occupy the Israeli government again, would love to occupy the mind and the heart of the Palestinians, but they're unable to do that. And so that hope piece in the midst of hopelessness, so that I work with Kairos Palestine, kairospalestine.ps. They have a document that they put out in 2009, and this is getting to the love piece. They've written a theological response to the occupation based on scripture, Christian scripture, and those charities of faith, hope, and love. And the love piece really is at the core of this document, which says we have to love our enemies. We're called to love the Jew who is oppressing us. And that is a sacrificial love. As the occupier and the one who is stealing your water and all of your resources and incarcerating your children against international law, to still, and I have not met yet, whether it's a storekeeper or a person working in a hotel, I have yet to meet a Palestinian who doesn't want peace with their Jewish neighbors and doesn't criticize the Jew, but criticizes the state of Israel and Jewish Zionism for what it's done to their people. So that kind of love that is willing to non-violently put one's resistance into action, knowing what the consequences can be, I think that's real love. And that stirs me.
That is incredible. And such a great example for those of us in the US about being individualistic, not so much based on community and loving your oppressor and wanting peace. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. So kind of a follow-up to that, just to delve into the Palestinian people, since you work so closely with them. You had also mentioned you saw examples of deep commitment among the Palestinians. And can you share just an example of that and why you think it's so important?
Say a little bit more about your question.
Yeah, just how they're so committed to their work, to their families, to getting ahead, and how they'll work so hard for it.
I'll just tell the story of the former director of the YMCA rehabilitation program in East Jerusalem, Nader. Nader has a lot of family in the U.S. that would say, come to the U.S. I'm thinking of Mona, the person who is senior trainer for the therapists at the Y. They have opportunities to leave and they don't leave. So that's a commitment to their community that just is very moving and very deep and sacrificial, because they send their kids to school every day knowing that this may be the day that the occupation forces come and confront the kids at school and maybe jerk somebody out of a class because they are accused of throwing a rock at a Jeep, an Israeli Jeep. And they don't know where that kid is for 24, 48 hours. And they're still hanging in because they see a future for the Palestinians, and they see a future for the Palestinian Muslims and Christians alongside the Jews in Israel. That's the kind of commitment that I'm talking about. And of course, the people that I get on these Zoom meetings with them, and I get off and I say, Janet, that's my congregation. Those are my folks. That's my people, because they stir me. They keep me involved. And the love they have for one another and their Muslim neighbors. You know, that's another false story that we hear, that the Muslims are running the Christians out of Palestine. It just couldn't be anything further from the truth. And that's where another place where we see the commitment of the Muslim leaders and the Christian leaders working together to strengthen their communities and to resist that occupation.
Absolutely. A commitment, to staying, to making it better, to resisting. Okay.
You'll hear the term beautiful resistance when you're there. And that's the commitment to building something beautiful in spite of their what's happening around them, whether it's an art project or a community event or something within a family. It's all of it is beautiful resistance when they're building something positive.
Absolutely. I mean, take, for example, the town that our group helps, Beit Umar in the West Bank. And they have a community center. They've done so much, backpacks for kids, trying to get computers for them, little camps, working on projects for women, to have markets and agricultural products. And it's just that, again, commitment to just, plowing ahead with life and doing what you need to do to have a good life, despite everything going around you. Okay. So Jeff, I was struck when you were talking about, the different languages and so forth. And this goes to when you were working in the East Jerusalem YMCA in the rehab for children. You didn't speak Arabic and they didn't speak English, and yet you connected. And that really touched me because I have a friend who speaks Arabic, and I was in the hospital with her when she gave birth, twice actually, but a few years ago. And these nurses just couldn't understand how we were friends because we could barely communicate. And finally, there was an Arab nurse, and she was trying to explain it. And she said, you don't have to speak the same language to be best friends. And I've never forgotten that. So can you elaborate on how that worked for you? Because I think sometimes people get hung up on, I can't, work with so-and-so. I can't work with, Spanish speakers. I don't speak Spanish, or I can't do this or that. I can't help refugees because I don't speak their language. So tell us how that can be successful and how connections with other human beings can transcend language.
Okay, let me begin by saying that I'm 71 years old. And I know that there are people listening and watching today that are wondering, gosh, how could I get involved, and why would I get involved at this age? And all I can say is we continue to receive much more than we give. And so if you're not an extrovert like I am, that can go into a room full of young adults that are anywhere from 16, 18 to 24 years old, with a teacher that's at the front of the classroom, Muslim, doesn't speak English either, but they're putting together the creches, the manger scenes that we buy in the stores, and using their hands again, working in glass, just to sit beside them and to help and to, the hand on the shoulder of those guys, and the smiles and the laughs when something happens. That's the kind of connection that you can speak. And when they know that we're there because we care. And they know we know they're there because as a result of the occupation and their suffering. And so just being present. In our church, when we talk about mission, we say we'll go where we're asked to go, and we'll do what we're asked to do. So we don't go in trying to shape something. We want to go in and do what we're asked to do. And we call that critical presence. So I think that's a piece of what you're talking about, Jennifer. In the hospital there, you were a critical presence to your friend who speaks Arabic and was giving birth at that point. And that's just to be able to go and do that and sit in silence. You know, when we first went, I was sure we could solve this thing in 2 weeks. What's wrong with folks over there? And it took a while for me to realize, wait a second, you're the old white male, heterosexual, wealth, educated, all those, you know, I'm kind of at the top of the pyramid that is collapsing. God. And it took a while to realize, no, it's not that it's complex, because it isn't. It's an occupation, an illegal occupation. It's that the people there have to find the solutions, and we need to stand beside them and do what we're asked to do there.
Absolutely. Service is so important, but we can't direct it. We need to listen to the needs and partner, not direct.
And so to continue with that thought about being 71, there's a place for anybody that is watching today to be in service. And even if that's just writing your congressperson, if it's, you know, finding a place, and you can check out the websites, and there's one even, I forget, don't even know what the name of it is, but there's a charity watch organization that can tell you where your money will be used for what you want to give it for, rather than administration. And even if it's not, even if, to give dollars is an important piece of that, of the service piece. So there's so many different ways to be involved. And I would say even on a local level, you know, school gets started. Go buy a backpack, a kid's backpack, and stuff it with school supplies. Just to deliver that is important. And it just says to those kids and to that school administration that's already under pressure with COVID, oh, the community cares about what we're doing here.
Right. So my next question was actually going to be about what you get back from when you serve. So a good segue. So what do you think that you both have gotten back from service, and what have others around you received, and how can others serve people whom they care about but have never met? And you just talked about a couple of those examples, but if you have any others.
You know, it sounds like a cliche, but it's absolutely true that we have gotten so much more than we've given. We've gotten to be part of people doing significant things in the world under very difficult situations. It's deepened us. It's helped us connect to the larger community. It's helped us see really the effects of policy, particularly from the West, and how damaging that can be on countries who have less power. So I think it's really added some dimensions to our lives that are sort of beyond estimation. And really people can get that anywhere. You know, whether you're you know, working with people in prison here in the U.S. or people who are you know, hungry and food insufficient. I mean, there's so many ways, but it gives so much more meaning to life. And we're just really grateful that we got to be a part of something that matters.
And that's the word I would pick up on, the meaning. So what I get out of my service is just a sense of meaning and purpose. And I want that to continue on in until they lay me down in the ground and say a few words over me. It's important to have that piece. We don't mean that we're out every day doing service and oh my goodness kind of thing. We enjoy life. We're taking off in the morning to go see our son and daughter-in-law in Scotland. We haven't seen for a year and a half. So we enjoy life too. We just know that to make time to make a difference makes a difference to us as well as it does in the world.
For sure. All right. So another really important part of service is not just donating money. It's not just, you know, physically being with people to help them, but it's also looking at and understanding what's going on politically in the United States and in Congress. And many folks will know Betty McCollum and the bills that she's introduced to defund Israel when the money from the United States is going, as you mentioned before, you know, to imprisoned children and do a lot of terrible things against the population over there. So can you speak, because this is so important and critical to the work that we work on in CFJ, these bills about defunding Israel when it's especially affecting the children over there. Can you give any updates on what's going on now? And then back to the service part, there's a campaign in Colorado, and how can people get involved in that, and what have you done with it? So go ahead, either one of you.
Good. I would say I'm not in favor of defunding Israel. I think there still can be a partner. Boy, the politics there are so strange and so convoluted as they are in our own country right now. But it's not defunding, it's holding Israel accountable for the funds that the U.S. is giving to them, especially, it's over $3 billion a year. And that figure goes way up when we talk about other contracts. And much of that $3 billion comes back to our own war machine here in the United States in terms of producing the helicopters and the bombs, the smart bombs, and Israel also is a great testing site partner for us on some of the newer weapons, like the phosphorus that was dropped in Gaza. That was one of the first times that was used. And so they can tell us how effective that was, and then we know how to use it in the future. And so we're wanting to hold Israel accountable. In fact, I wish I had looked this up for you, but if you go to, I'll think of it in a minute, but there's an agency that follows the use of U.S. funds by foreign governments, and you can find that on the State Department. There are contractual legal things passed by Congress about how money can be used and how it cannot be used. And Israel seems to slip through every crack that's there, and it's not even a crack. I mean, it's quite clear that they're using money that if we did a test case in the courts might rule in Israel's favor, because courts don't just follow the law, they follow the political whims and win in a country as well. But that money now with the McCollum bill, we are wanting to hold Israel accountable to prohibit the use of funds to to arrest children and hold them in detention without any warrant. It's illegal to arrest and to put them in jail anyway under national law. And to do the forced removals that are happening in East Jerusalem as the state of Israel wants to Judaize the Arab quarter there in Jerusalem, and a couple of other things that are in that bill. But the change from the previous McCollum bill to this
24/7, right? To the new one, 2590, right?
2590, House Resolution 2590. It is saying anywhere in the world that children are being incarcerated and people are forced removed from their homes and the other kinds of conditions. And I think that opens it up to more support for that bill, because we're not then just isolating Israel through that bill and through that accountability, but that should happen in all these other places of oppression around the world as well. The last count, there were 27 House representatives that have signed on to McCollum's bill, which is more than what had signed on to the earlier bill. And transitioning now to what's happening in Colorado. Rob,
before we do that, how are we doing Colorado-wise? Not all of our listeners are from Colorado, but how are our representatives doing? Anybody signed on? No.
Hello, anybody? No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Colin Wright, yes. Okay, go ahead about the campaign.
And I would also say that, and this is a political statement, but AIPAC, the American Israel Political Action Committee, has had in the past an enormous influence upon our elected leaders. Most of them, including Joe Neguse in our own District 2 for the U.S. House, was offered, I don't know if he went on the trip, but he was offered the free trip to Israel, where you get the indoctrination and you're told about how Israel's under constant threat. They have one of the most powerful armies in the world, and they're not the little David that is facing this huge Goliath. It's the other way around. But those representatives, many of them receive wonderful support through AIPAC and also Christian Zionists,
right,
to continue to just not say anything. You don't have to be supportive of Israel, just don't say anything against Israel or sign any resolution.
Right. Okay, so to our campaign, what's going on in Colorado right now?
Well, Rob Prince in Boulder and Sergio Attal, I think he's in Denver proper, but several of us, including some Unitarian Universalists here in Fort Collins and Palestinians and Jews here in Fort Collins, we've tried to approach Joe Neguse, our representative, and just have not had an opportunity to meet with him. We're often given an opportunity to meet with staff, but it's not staff that is on his foreign policy team. It's just the general staff in the office who really don't know anything about the situation. They take notes and they tell us that they'll report it. We are really insisting to get a meeting with Joe about HR 2590. And so just serendipitously, a bunch of us came together and we've created a letter that will be mailed soon to, or not mailed, but probably delivered to the Boulder office, and then copies delivered to the Fort Collins office. And I think there's an office up in the mountain communities, as well as to his office in DC, that is asking, 1, for a meeting with him, and 2, for him to sign on to McCollum's bill.
And will this letter be made public, or would people who are interested in doing it in their own districts, would they be able to find out more about it?
Yes, and Jennifer, I'm so sorry I'm not prepared with this, but there's a group in Delaware that had one of their congresswomen, I think, finally sign on, and they had a very good campaign. And maybe if Rob or Sergio were listening and have the chat available, they could put that website up, because it does help walk people through how they can approach their congresspeople. We are not confrontative in this letter. We're saying we're your constituents, and we want to have a time to talk to you about an important issue, especially after the bombings in Gaza and the blocking of the Damascus Gate area on Ramadan, and those force removals that are impending here in East Jerusalem. We want to talk about that. And so we drafted the letter, and then we've circulated it to as many groups in Joe's district, Representative Naguse, sorry, in his district, asking them to sign on to the letter. And I think at this point we have 6 or 7 groups that have signed on, and we'll be delivering that letter soon. Now, we began to share with anybody our process, but it really is a matter of informing our congresspeople too. Not just their staff, but getting an opportunity to get their ear.
And then just for our listeners, again, this is the information for CFJ. So if you would like to get in touch with Jeff or Janet, you can always visit our website, contact us via our email, and then we can put it through to them. And then we'll give Rob and Sergio a chance to find that information from Delaware if they can. But I mean, everything you've spoken about is so important. And if our listeners want to go back, we did a program with a lady who had done her master's dissertation on the Leahy laws, which of course prohibit the United States from doing a lot of the things that are going on right now with the funds to Israel, when it's unaccounted for and used for atrocious reasons. So I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to turn it over, speaking of Sergio, to him so he can ask you any questions that have come in through our chat. So my final question is, what message do you want to send to our listeners? What do you most want them to know, since this is kind of a platform for you to speak out in solidarity with the work we're doing? What would you like to say about this topic?
I'll begin on that, just to say that one is, if you're tuned in to this, then you're part of the movement for human rights and for moving into a more just world. So you're already a part of it. Thank you very much for that. And I guess, and I'm presuming that the people tuned in today are already aware of the fact that we cannot count on our major media in the United States to tell us the truth, not just about Palestine and Israel, but we know from the Vietnam papers and the lies that were told before we went into Iraq. And now the lies are coming out that our generals and our presidents and all the rest have told about how things are getting better in Afghanistan, when they simply have not. And so a message I would leave is to seek out some of those alternative news medias, because that's one place. And then judge for yourself. I mean, balance out, and you don't have to take whatever those media sources are telling us either, but do see that there are other accounts of what's happening in the world. And they're not just the commercial accounts that we get on MSNBC and Fox News and CNN.
Right.
Yeah.
Avoid the fake news. Okay, Janet?
I was just going to say, do some investigation and then speak up. You know, we all have neighbors or friends or family members, and it doesn't have to be in a confrontational way, but speak up about what you've learned or what you've seen. Or, you know, if you can go to Israel, Palestine, it's even more powerful because it's right there. You can't be there and not see it. So, yeah. And then be willing to say something to somebody.
And one more thing, we've used, you know, the word apartheid is kind of an anathema in this conversation about Israel and Palestine. And
But it's being used.
what's that?
It's being used.
It is being used now, even on some of the news. The major media is beginning to seek out some leaders in Palestine to hear from their point of view too, not just the farmer in his field that suffered because of a bomb that was dropped there in the West Bank. But what I wanted to say, I just lost my thought about that.
About apartheid.
Nope, that's okay. Oh yeah, thank you. Bet Salem is maybe the most respected Jewish human rights organization in Israel. They used to report to the military about the shootings and the deaths at the IDF and other abuses of international law to the military. They quit doing that because the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, weren't doing a thing with those reports. They just came out with a report in January that has called what is happening between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, which means in Israel proper and in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, apartheid. And then Human Rights Watch came out shortly after that and described what's happening there as apartheid too. So those people who use it, from the folks that are blindly supporting the state of Israel and what it's doing over there, will want to accuse us of anti-Semitism when we use that word. But even Bishop Tutu down in South Africa and others have said Tutu's kind of famous for saying what's happening in Palestine is worse than what happened to us in South Africa. That kind of blows my mind, but
right.
He would know. So, yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, just the importance of speaking out and learning for ourselves. And that's what we're all about at CFJ, is that education.
Yeah,
So
don't be afraid.
Yeah, don't be afraid. I'm going to take myself off the stream and turn it over to Sergio, who is also a member of CFJ, and see if there are some questions that have come in from the chat. We have 2 minutes left, but maybe we'll spend about 4 or 5 just in case. All right.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you
Jennifer.
so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Hey, Sergio.
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good.
Thank you, guys. This is a great presentation. We do have a few questions that I wanted to get right on.
And we should answer quickly or short, huh?
Yeah. One of them is how does Kairos represent the Christian Palestinian voice, and how does it represent Palestinians in general? So the voice of Palestinians in general, because Kairos is obviously a Christian organization, and so we're wondering to what extent Kairos does represent the overall voice of the Christians in Palestine.
Yeah, thanks. The Kairos Palestine is obviously a church organization that is comprised of leaders and lay people across the religious spectrum in Palestine. And I should say also in the 48, they call it the 48 Palestine, which means pre-occupation and pre-giving of that land away by the British and the international community to Israel. So, and they're no different in Palestine than they are, we Christians, than anywhere else. We often have a better time talking to people of other faiths than we do within our own interfaith circles. So there's the Latin Catholic Church, which is the Roman Catholic Church expression in Palestine, the Greek Orthodox, the Protestant churches, some of the independent churches, and the Anglican churches, the historic churches there too, including the Presbyterians. They're all part of the Kairos Palestine movement. And it took a while. If people do check out www.kairospalestine.ps, they'll see the document there a moment of truth, and the religious leaders across the board in Palestine that signed on to that. So
do you see the message being any different from the Muslim communities?
I'm sorry?
Do you see the message of Kairos and the proclamation that the Kairos document makes in regards to their occupation? Do you see any difference from a religious standpoint, being Christian, than that would be manifested by Muslim communities?
I'm maybe speaking outside of my knowledge, but from what I've seen and what I've experienced there, the Muslims have their own sacred scriptures that speak of justice and of people of the book, meaning Jews and Christians. And so I see the same movement happening within the Muslim community that's non-violently resisting the occupation. But if you go to any of the sites, the popular sites where people every day are protesting in the West Bank, you'll see Muslims, Christians, and Jews who cross into the West Bank to join them in their nonviolent resistance. They're hand in hand in these things. And so the Muslims are as involved in this nonviolent resistance movement as are the Christians. And we have a shopkeeper we love over there, and I gave him a copy of that document. And he came back and said how much he appreciated reading that and learning about that Christian response to the occupation, and shared how the Muslim has a very similar response to that. And we haven't said this, but it's important to get this in. We have many, we know of many Jews in Israel that are as vehemently opposed to the practices and the policies and the laws of Israel, including the most recent, well, it was actually in 2019 or 2018 when Israel passed what clearly turned apartheid into apartheid by law. And people can look up that law as well too, but many Jews that are there on the front line of that nonviolent resistance as well. So again, our problem is not with any faith, it's with the state of Israel and its Zionist policies to have the whole of historic Palestine for itself.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question here that's for Janet. And this is in regards to the PTSD that is typically treated after a traumatic event. But Palestinians under occupation live under a continuing trauma. So how is it that PTSD can be properly treated?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question we all had maybe 10 years ago when we were working with the Palestinians, because we saw clearly that nothing is nothing is over there in terms of trauma. And what we found was that through this technique, this psychotherapy of EMDR, that if we can treat the traumas as they happen, that it builds resilience in people, and it doesn't, it makes them more able to cope with what's in front of them or what's ahead. So, but it was a big question we had. There was some good research done about, gosh, if someone gets treated for a traumatic event, but then there's another one and another one, does it help? And the answer was yes, this therapy actually can help. It can help build those coping skills and that resilience, and do away with the nightmares and the hypervigilance and all of those kinds of reactions that people get from traumatic events.
Thank you. Well, there's a few other questions, but I think we better turn it back to Jennifer because time's up.
Well, Jennifer, if people want to send you their questions, and you can forward those to us, we'll be happy to answer them. And we certainly invite them to go with us on one of the alternative tours that we lead to Palestine and Israel, where we spend about half the time at religious sites, the historic ones, and then half the time meeting with Jews and Muslims and Christians who are working for a just peace. And we also bid on to one of the settlements, the Jewish settlements built illegally on West Bank territory. And I would want to say that we don't make a profit on our trips. We try to keep them very cost effective. Our profit is getting people over there to see what's really happening. And they come back changed and committed Oh, your sound is off.
You'd think
And I'll
after 18 months of COVID streaming, you'd get that down. But as we were talking today, I realized I happen to have one of these in my house. Does this look familiar to you? I happen to have a Kairos Palestine pamphlet, so I thought that was very appropriate. So thank you so much again.
Janet.
I was just going to say, on our trips, we don't have a pre-programmed outcome that we want everybody to get to. We want people to come and see, and then they make up their own minds.
Yeah.
Right. That's what it's all about. Yep. Educate. Yeah. So thank you for these main topics tonight. Good advice, good thoughts to send people away with, how we can serve others, how we can get involved, how we can learn for ourselves, and how we can educate others. So thank you again so much for this. And then for any of our viewers, this will be posted on Facebook, so you can always get to it, and YouTube. And we'll be sure to announce on our website and through our email when we'll have another program again soon. So thank you so much, Jeff and Janet, and all our viewers, and have a wonderful night. Take care.
Thank you. Our pleasure.
Bye.